Hey everyone, my name is Alex Haney, and today I'm going to be talking about paddling trips versus backpacking trips as your first backcountry experience. I've had a lot of people message me asking me, I've never done a backcountry trip before, and I see that you do backpacking trips as well as paddling trips and have experience with both. So which one do you suggest for a first-timer in the backcountry? Okay, so I wish there was a clear-cut, simple answer to this, but you're gonna have to stick around and hear me out because there are definitely big pros and cons to each option. Now, needless to say, I'm going to be talking about very basic intro level type of trips here. Just basic trails for backpacking and flat, easy water for paddling, and I'm only going to be talking about canoeing because I really don't have much experience with kayaking trips. In general, I would say that a paddling trip is usually easier physically and to prepare for than a backpacking trip. And there's a big but coming, so be sure to stick around and hear me out on that. But I do find backpacking to be more physically strenuous, covering the same distances than canoeing would be. Because in backpacking, you're carrying everything the entire time and using the same muscles the whole time, I found it a lot more strenuous. Whereas canoeing tends to be more of a full body workout. If you're doing portaging, you get to switch up between different muscle groups. So you're switching between paddling, using your upper body, and using more your lower body or just full body for portaging. Canoeing is definitely easier to prep for as a beginner. You don't have to be as meticulous with your weight and what you're packing. And as a beginner, you're gonna overpack. It's just inevitable, and canoeing is just a lot more forgiving of that than backpacking is. Just because of the fact that you're not carrying everything the entire time. You don't need to worry about having the lightest gear. You don't really need to worry that much about overpacking. It's a really good way to make the transition from being a car camper into being a backcountry camper, because in fact I've done canoe trips where either I wasn't portaging or I only had maybe one short portage, 200 or less meters, and in those instances I was actually able to pack for it like a lightweight car camping trip. I even brought my folding Coleman car camping stove. I brought all the luxuries a lot of the luxuries that I would usually bring only car camping. That's definitely something you can't do with backpacking. And part of the reason you're able to do that is because you have that canoe there to help you carry that load. And even if you're portaging, you can go back and do 2 carries, you can do 3 carries, whatever you want to do based on the amount of time you have. But that's definitely something you can't do with backpacking because you just gotta go and keep going forward. Now here comes the big huge but. And that is that paddling in general requires more skill and more gear than backpacking. People here in Canada tend to have this attitude that because they're Canadian and because canoeing is kind of part of our culture, that they kind of instinctually know how to do it. And while, tons of people do go on canoeing trips with no prior experience and survive just fine, at the very least, it's going to be a lot harder than it needs to be, and you're potentially going to get really frustrated. Worst case scenario would be, if you really don't have any clue what you're doing and you just end up seriously putting your life in danger. This happens with backpacking and paddling trips, but at the same time, every year here in Canada, I hear of stories of novice paddlers dying because of simple things like that they didn't know to zip up their PFDs and just simple stuff like that. Paddling is definitely something that can take a lifetime to master. There's so much stuff that goes into it that novices don't realize. It's not just, putting your paddle in the water. You could argue the same thing for backpacking too. There is a lot of skill involved in different levels of backpacking, but at the same time there's not as steep of a learning curve, because in both cases, if you're doing just a beginner's trip, I think that it takes more initial skill to get started with paddling than it does with backpacking, which is essentially just walking if you're doing something that's intro level, you know what I mean? On top of learning just, basic safety and paddling skills, you're also going to learn need to learn how to lift and portage a canoe if you are going to be portaging. Another thing to consider with paddling is that you have to definitely be a lot more careful about really waterproofing your stuff. With backpacking, you know, you can just get away with putting a garbage bag in your pack and putting all your stuff in that, and that will probably be fine. But with paddling, you really gotta make sure that everything's watertight, because not only are you dealing with rain falling on your pack like you are with backpacking, but you have to also worry about it potentially falling in the water and getting fully submersed. And then on top of that, if it is raining and you're paddling all day, then there's going to be an accumulation of water in the bottom of your boat, and then your pack is going to be sitting in that all day. So with backpacking, it's tempting to say, you know, it's easier to get into than paddling because there is a lot less gear involved. Hiking will generally be cheaper on that first trip or those first few trips, because you're not having to rent things like a canoe and paddles and a PFD and all the safety equipment. As a beginner, you're probably going to be assuming that you're going to be carrying more or less the same stuff on either trip because you haven't learned yet really what's necessary. So in that sense, it makes sense if you think about it to go with backpacking because there's just less gear. It's all the same stuff minus all of the paddling gear. But the big but with backpacking is that carrying that gear is going to be a lot less comfortable on a backpacking trip than it would be in a paddling trip. You know, 9 times out of 10, the intro gear that you're going to have for backcountry is a lot heavier and a lot bulkier than the gear you'll probably end up with if you decide that this is a hobby that you're really into. On top of that, there are a couple other crucial things with backpacking that you just don't know about yet, like how to fit a pack correctly, which matters a lot more for hiking trips than paddling trips. Like, it really doesn't matter so much on a paddling trip if it doesn't fit correctly, but with backpacking, you know, you're carrying that the entire time. It's got to fit correctly or else you're going to be in some real pain. And same thing goes for shoes. With backpacking, the shoes are a lot more important. You don't yet know, you know, what kind of shoes work for you, and that's definitely something that you just can't know that on your first trip. It's something that definitely comes with experience. I will say that if you just do decide to get into backpacking as opposed to paddling, you know, you might think that paddling has a lot more gear associated with it. But really, either sport, you know, if you're really going to get into it, there's a lot of stuff to spend your money on. It just goes to different types of things, you know, like the shoes and the pack are a lot more important for backpacking. You're going to spend a lot more money on ultralight gear. So I hope some of these tips have helped you narrow it down a little bit. But I do want to say that the most important thing when getting into backcountry travel is just to think about, you know, what is your preference? Are you a huge fan of hiking, or are you a huge fan of the water? And the other big thing is what's available in your area and what the culture is for backcountry travel in your area. Because some areas are really huge for backpacking and there's endless opportunities for backpacking. And then there's places like here where I live in Ontario where you can really, all the backpacking options, you could be done in one season. There's not a lot here. Like, the way to get into the backcountry is with a canoe. If you have any comments to add, please leave them down below. I would love to hear from you guys. If you agree, disagree, I want to know in the comments. If you are a beginner who's tried different things, I want to hear from you as well. What did you think of paddling versus backpacking? I'll see you next week, guys. Bye.